She was 16 years old when the only door she had ever called her own was shut against her, and she stood on the porch boards of the house where she had been born and listened to the bolt slide home. The man who turned that bolt was her stepfather, Silas Grunwald. And the reason he gave the gathered neighbors was that she was too much mouth and too little use, though the truth, known only to the two of them, was that she had caught him falsifying the ledgers of her late father's mill and refused to hold her tongue about it. She left the town of Hollow Creek, Minnesota, with $4.11 sewn into the hem of her only good dress, a tin cup, and her mother's sewing needle wrapped in a scrap of flannel. With that $4.11, she would, within the month, come to own a collapsed, rusted, sawdust-choked icehouse on the edge of Kettle Lake that every soul in 3 counties considered worthless, a building so far gone that the county assessor had stopped bothering to list it on the tax rolls at all. She bought it because no one else wanted it, and because a roof, even a rotting one, was still a roof. She did not know, when she pushed open that groaning door for the first time, that behind its double-thick walls of sawdust and cedar plank lay a secret sealed away for 11 years, a secret that would not only save her, but would return to an entire town something it did not even know it had lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Adaline Voss, if you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, a town passed over, a house left empty, a name nobody thought to remember. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Adaline Voss had been born in the spring of 1873 in a 2-room house that smelled always of pine shavings and lamp oil, the daughter of Elias Voss, who ran the only ice-cutting operation on Kettle Lake, and his wife Marrow, a Quebecois woman with a gift for numbers that she passed down whole to her daughter. Elias Voss was not a rich man by the standards of the cities, but in Hollow Creek, where winters were long and summers longer, where the dairies and the butcher and the little hospital, 3 towns overall, depended on ice cut clean from Kettle Lake and packed away through the hot months, he was a man of consequence. Every February, when the lake had frozen thick and true, Elias and his crew of 12 men would go out with saws and horses and ice plows, cutting great blue-white blocks from the surface, hauling them by sledge to the icehouse he had built with his own hands on the North Shore, a building of double walls packed 20 inches deep with sawdust for insulation, so well made that ice cut in February could still be sold, cold and solid, come August. Adaline grew up on that lake. She learned to read the ice the way other children learned their letters, how a certain milky color meant weakness, how a low hum underfoot meant the water beneath had begun to move, how frost feathering on the surface in a particular pattern meant a cold snap was coming that would thicken the whole lake overnight. She learned to keep the books alongside her mother, entering every load sold, every debt owed, every dollar that came in and went back out, in a careful hand that Marrow taught her was not just arithmetic but honesty made visible. A ledger, her mother used to say, turning the pages by lamplight, is a promise written down. You do not break a promise just because no one is looking. Adaline turned those words over so many times in her childhood that they became less something she remembered and more something she simply was. Her father died when she was 11, thrown from a sledge when the ice gave beneath the horses on a warm February afternoon that had fooled everyone. And Kettle Lake swallowed him before any man could reach him. Marrow, grieving and alone with a business she had never wanted to run without her husband, made the decision, out of necessity more than affection, to marry Silas Grunwald 2 years later. Silas was a business associate of Elias's, a man who had lent the ice company money during a lean year and had never quite let anyone forget it. He was outwardly respectable, a deacon at the Hollow Creek Methodist Church, well-spoken at town meetings, generous with his handshake. But Adaline, who had inherited her mother's gift for numbers and her father's gift for reading what lay beneath the smooth surface, Began noticing within a year of the marriage that the ice company's books no longer matched the ice company's business. Loads were recorded as sold that had never left the ice house. Payments were logged from customers who, when she quietly asked around, said they had paid Silas in cash and never seen a receipt. Her mother, worn thin by grief and by a marriage that had cooled fast into something more like management than partnership, did not want to hear it. "He is providing for us," Marrow would say, not quite meeting her daughter's eyes. And Adaline learned to keep her suspicions to herself, filing them away the way she filed away everything, carefully. And for later, Marrow died of a fever in the winter. Adaline turned 15, and with her mother's death, the last soft thing standing between Adaline and Silas Grunwald disappeared entirely. Silas had by then folded the Voss Ice Company fully into his own holdings, the mill, a share of the general store, and now the ice trade too, and he made no secret, in the year that followed, that a stepdaughter who asked questions about numbers was a stepdaughter he had no further use for. The end came on an October evening when Adaline, going through the ledger drawer for a receipt her mother had once shown her, found instead a second set of books, hidden beneath a false bottom in the drawer, recording payments to Silas from the county road commissioner that had nothing to do with ice at all. Payments she would only understand years later, connected to something far larger than a dishonest ledger. She said nothing that night, but Silas, coming upon her at the desk with the drawer open, understood immediately what she had seen, and by morning her few belongings were on the porch and the door was bolted behind her. She had $4.11, the clothes on her back, and nowhere in Hollow Creek that would take her in. For Silas Grunwald's word carried weight, and hers at 16 carried none at all. She walked the 11 miles to the county seat of Marrow Falls with her boots wearing thin. And she took a room above the livery for 2 nights on credit she was not sure she could repay. And she began, with the particular clear-eyed practicality her mother had raised in her, to think not about what had been done to her, but about what she was going to do next. What she did next was walk past the county courthouse on a gray Tuesday morning and see a notice pinned to the board announcing a tax forfeiture auction of abandoned lakeside properties, to be held that very afternoon on the courthouse steps. Most of the parcels listed meant nothing to her, but one line, halfway down the page, stopped her boots on the boardwalk entirely. The old Kearney Icehouse, north shore of Kettle Lake, condemned and abandoned. Minimum bid $6. She knew that icehouse. It was not her father's. Her father's had burned in a grease lamp fire the year after his death, while Silas was already managing the business. A fire that had always struck Adaline as remarkably convenient. But the Kearney Icehouse, a mile further up the shore, had belonged to a rival outfit that folded when manufactured ice from the new plant in Marrow Falls began undercutting lake ice sold the old way. It had stood empty and rotting for nearly a decade. Everyone in 3 counties considered it worthless, sawdust gone damp and sour, roof caved in on one corner, the whole structure leaning like a man asleep on his feet. When the auctioneer called it that afternoon, no one else so much as raised a hand. Adaline, standing at the back of the small crowd in her one good dress with her whole fortune sewn into the hem, heard herself say, in a voice steadier than she felt, $6. The auctioneer, an older man with tired, not unkind eyes, looked at her for a long moment, a girl alone, 16, clearly recently thrown out of somewhere by the state of her boots, and then brought his gavel down. "Sold," he said, to the young lady for $6. Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else muttered that she had just bought herself a pile of rotten wood and wasted sawdust. Adaline paid her $6, kept her back straight, and did not look at any of them. Asterisk. She walked the 1.5 miles from Marrow Falls to the north shore of Kettle Lake with the last of the October light going gold and thin behind her. And she stood for a long while in front of the building that was now against all reasonable sense, hers. It leaned, it smelled of rot and standing water. One whole corner of the roof had folded in on itself years ago and never been repaired. And yet, she noticed this even in that first exhausted moment, the walls themselves. The great double-thick timber walls, packed with sawdust, that had made men like Kearney and her own father a living for 20 years, were still standing true. Whoever had built this ice house had built it to last. And the years and the weather had not yet managed to argue him out of it. She spent that first night inside it. On a bed of dry sawdust raked from the one corner the rain had not reached, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the building creak and settle around her like something breathing. In the morning, with a borrowed hatchet from a sympathetic farmer down the shore road, who asked no questions and offered no charity beyond the loan of a tool, she began to clear the ruined section of roof, meaning only to make the building weathertight before the first real frost. It was in prying loose a section of the north wall's inner cladding, cedar board gone black with age, nailed over the sawdust insulation in a pattern that struck her, even in her exhaustion, as somehow too deliberate, too carefully fitted for a simple insulating wall, that her hatchet caught not on solid timber, but on something hollow. She stopped. She set the hatchet down. And she began, with her bare hands and the small kitchen knife that was one of the only tools she owned outright, to work the board free. Behind it was not sawdust at all, but a shallow recessed cavity, dry as a bone despite everything the building had suffered. And inside that cavity sat a strongbox no larger than a bread loaf, its iron lock gone to rust-orange lace, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp out for what must have been the better part of a decade. She sat back on her heels in the cold, dim light of the ruined icehouse and stared at it for a long time before she touched it again. When she finally worked the rusted lock loose with a stone, what she found inside would occupy the rest of her waking hours and most of her sleeping ones, for weeks to come. Wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth were papers, not gold, not jewels, nothing so simple as treasure, though what she found would in time prove worth far more to her and to Hollow Creek than gold could have been. There was a ledger in a careful, familiar hand that made her chest go tight before she even understood why. Her own father's handwriting, dated in the final year of his life. And bound with it, a set of surveyor's documents and a hand-drawn map of the north shore of Kettle Lake, and a bundle of correspondence between Elias Voss and the man who had originally built this very icehouse. Warwick Kearney, she read by lamplight borrowed from the farmer down the road. And slowly, over 3 sleepless nights, the shape of the secret her father had hidden emerged. In the year before his death, Elias Voss and Warwick Kearney, rivals in the ice trade by daylight, but old friends since boyhood, it seemed, by every letter that passed between them, had together uncovered something that threatened both their businesses and the whole town of Hollow Creek at once. The county road commissioner, in league with a rising local businessman the letters referred to only as SG, had been quietly filing false surveys that redrew the boundary of the public shore access along Kettle Lake, converting what had for 40 years been common land every ice company, every fisherman, every farmer's family used freely to reach the water, into private parcels that SG intended to buy up cheaply from the county and then lease back to the very ice companies and fishermen who had always used it for free. It was, in the plain language of one of Elias's own letters to Kearney, a theft dressed up in a surveyor's ink, and if it is allowed to stand, this whole lake will belong to one man inside of 5 years. Elias and Kearney had gathered proof, the original, uncorrupted survey documents, witness statements, and a signed affidavit from the county's own retired surveyor, a man named Otto Hoff, attesting that the boundary had been deliberately falsified, and they had hidden that proof together, splitting the danger of holding it between their 2 ice houses, trusting that if anything happened to one of them, The other would carry the fight forward. Elias Voss had died on the ice less than 2 months after that letter was written. Warwick Kearney, the correspondence showed, had grown afraid in the aftermath, afraid enough that he sold his ice house and left Hollow Creek entirely within the year, never recovering his half of the hidden proof, perhaps never even certain, by the end, whether Elias's death on a warm February afternoon had truly been an accident at all, and the initials on the letters, S.G. Adaline sat with that for the better part of an hour before she let herself finish the thought. Silas Grunwald had not simply married his way into a grieving widow's ice business. He had orchestrated, over the better part of a decade, the quiet theft of the public shoreline of Kettle Lake itself. And her father had died trying to stop him. Word travels fast in a small county, even about a girl no one thinks much of. And it did not take long for Hollow Creek to hear that the Voss girl, thrown out, penniless, laughed at for buying a ruin, had been seen carrying strange bundles of paper out of the old Kearney place and asking pointed questions of the county's retired surveyor. Silas Grunwald heard it faster than anyone, and he did not take it lightly. He came to her himself on a cold morning in November. Standing in the doorway of the ice house she had by then patched well enough to keep the wind out. And he did not raise his voice. He never needed to, but he told her plainly that whatever old papers she thought she'd found were worthless without a name attached to them that anyone in this county would believe, and that a girl with her history of being difficult would find very few doors open to her if she went around telling stories about respected men. He offered her, with the same smooth generosity he had always shown in public, $20 to forget the whole matter and leave the county for good. She did not take it. What Adaline did instead was quiet and patient, in the way her mother's ledgers had taught her to be patient. She could not simply walk into a town meeting and accuse a deacon of the Methodist Church of theft and possibly murder on the strength of old letters alone. She understood with a clarity beyond her years that Silas was right about one thing: her word alone would not be believed. So she went, first, to Otto Hoff, the retired surveyor whose affidavit sat among her father's papers, and found the old man still living, still sharp, and still carrying a decade of unspoken guilt for having let fear silence him after Elias Voss's death. He agreed this time to speak. She went next to Warwick Kearney's widowed sister, still living 2 counties over, and through her located a copy of a second affidavit Kearney himself had sworn before he fled Hollow Creek, one he had never dared to file. She spent the whole of that winter walking, asking, gathering, rebuilding piece by piece the case her father and Warwick Kearney had begun and never finished, while by day she worked to repair the ice house itself, patching its roof, repacking its walls with fresh sawdust hauled from the Marrow Falls mill in exchange for labor, preparing it, almost without admitting to herself why, to cut ice again, *. Silas did not sit idle through that winter either. He spread word subtly that the Voss girl had gone strange with grief and was making wild accusations to cover her own family's old debts. He pressured the county clerk, an old associate of his, to delay any hearing on the shoreline survey question indefinitely. And when February came and the lake froze thick and true, and Adaline, with 2 hired local boys and her father's own ice saws, recovered from a shed the farmer down the road had been storing for her, began cutting ice from Kettle Lake for the first time in a decade, Silas moved to crush her outright. He went to the bank in Marrow Falls, called in an old debt her father had left unpaid at his death, a debt Adaline had never even known existed, and had the county moved to seize the ice house itself for non-payment before her first load of ice had even sold. It was Otto Hoff, in the end, who would not let that happen quietly. At the town meeting called to approve the seizure, a meeting Silas clearly expected to be a formality, the old surveyor stood up unbidden and asked to be heard, and told the room, in a voice that shook at first and then steadied, Exactly what he had seen a decade before. A falsified survey. A shoreline stolen from the public, a few careful acres at a time. And a debt against Elias Voss's icehouse that had been quietly purchased and held. He now believed by the very man calling for its seizure. Adaline, standing at the back of that hall in the same dress she had worn to the auction, stepped forward then and laid before the county clerk her father's original survey, Kearney's recovered affidavit, and Hoff's sworn testimony, and asked only that the county compare them, honestly, to the records on file. The comparison took 3 weeks. It found precisely as Elias Voss and Warwick Kearney had documented before their courage or their lives ran out, that the shoreline survey filed a decade earlier did not match the original, that acres of common land had indeed been quietly converted to private holding, and that the debt used to seize the Kearney Icehouse traced back, through 2 shell purchases, to Silas Grunwald himself. He was not hanged, and he was not driven from the county in chains. For the law in that place and time moved slowly and imperfectly, even against a guilty man, but he was stripped of his position at the church, his standing at the bank, and his claim to every acre of shoreline he had stolen. All of it returned by county order to public use. He left Hollow Creek within the season, quietly, the way men like him always do when the ground beneath their feet is finally, undeniably gone. Adaline Voss kept the icehouse. She rebuilt it fully that spring. Its walls packed thick and true again with fresh sawdust, its roof sound. And she reopened the ice trade on Kettle Lake, not as a rival business, but as a shared one, offering fair contracts to every dairy, every fisherman, every family who needed cold storage through the summer heat, at prices that remembered what her mother had once told her about a ledger being a promise written down. The shoreline that Silas Grunwald had spent a decade stealing acre by careful acre was restored to the whole town, marked now with a modest public landing that the county, at Otto Hoff's insistence, named the Voss Landing, over Adaline's own quiet objection that she had done nothing more than finish what her father started, and that, in the end, is the whole of it, a girl thrown out at 16 with $4.11, who bought a rusted, forgotten icehouse that everyone else in the county considered worthless, and who found inside its walls not gold, but the truth her father had died trying to protect, sealed away and waiting a decade for someone patient enough and honest enough to come looking for it. What stunned Hollow Creek was never really the hidden strongbox, though the whole town talked of little else for a year. What stunned them was that the girl they had let walk out of town with nothing had been carrying, all along, the same quiet integrity her mother had once described so simply, a promise, written down, that she refused to let anyone break, not even after everything had been taken from her. Not even when no one at all was looking. Adaline Voss ran the ice trade on Kettle Lake for the better part of 30 years after that winter. And it is said in Hollow Creek even now that no ledger of hers was ever found short a single cent, and no family who needed ice through a hard summer was ever turned away for lack of money to pay for it. The icehouse still stands today, they say, repaired so many times over the decades that little of the original timber remains, except, if you know just where to look along the north wall, one section of cedar board, fitted a little too carefully, that no one in the family has ever had the heart to replace. Thank you for spending this time with Adaline's story, and with us. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding today that value is not always visible from the outside, and that a promise honestly kept can outlast the person who tried hardest to break it. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close. ***.